365 Sports, we're joined by one of our favorite guests, Front Office Sports, Amanda Christovich. Amanda, Title IX is something I think that the American public generally only has a broad strokes idea of what it is, and the House settlement, the same thing. These two things have now collided in that the Department of Education has decided that they've put conditions on House settlement money as it relates to equality pay and all of that. Can you break it down what the Department of Education said to the NCAA about the House settlement payments and how they must relate to Title IX under the current administration, which is 2 more days, view of it?
Yes. Okay. So I think the one sentence summary here is that the Department of Education said that if you want to pay your players, if you want to revenue share with them, your payments need to be, quote, proportionate between men's sports athletes and women's sports athletes. Do we know what exactly the word proportionate means? Not currently. I tried to do a little digging last night, but that was like kind of all that was said. So with that in mind, I'll give a little bit more detail about Title IX and the House settlement, right? So Title IX is the 50-year-old statute that basically says if you are a federally funded educational institution, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. It doesn't say anything specifically about sports, but over time it's become the statute that governs equity in sports, in educational settings in high school, college, and even younger, but let's focus on college, right? So that's what the statute is. And then when you add the House settlement to it, there's been this question, the House settlement, among many things, is going to create an opportunity for schools to pay players. But they have to pay every single player in their athletic department, not just the football players and the men's basketball players. So the question has been, is Title IX, the statute that requires equal opportunities in an athletic department, going to apply to how much you pay your players? We assumed the answer was going to be yes, but we didn't know for sure. And what I'd like to point out is interesting is that, college, football coaches and athletic departments have been like trumpeting these plans of we're going to pay our players 75% of all the House revenue. And I've been sitting here going, well, Title IX is going to apply at some point because it applies to literally every other part of an athletic department. So we finally got our answer yesterday. But yes, as you noted, this administration is, essentially a lame duck administration. This is like an 11th hour decision, and I wouldn't be surprised if the second that the Trump administration appointees get into the Department of Education, they're going to completely reverse this or change it or rewrite it.
Yeah, I want to try to stay away from like the politics of it all, but it's hard because very simply, the incoming administration and the incoming Department of Education people are being run by an administration that doesn't believe that department should exist. So things 100%. Are going to change.
And it's look, Trump already had an administration that we can look back at for clues about what he's going to do. And it's not partisan to say, that in his previous administration, the Department of Education did not have really strict Title IX adjudication. They didn't put a lot of resources into cases related to Title IX. Whether you agree with that or not is up to you, right? But that's what he did. And in this administration, yes, he says that ultimately he would like to sunset the federal Department of Education. But in the meantime, he's expected to appoint a Secretary of Education who obviously Linda McMahon hasn't been confirmed yet, but the expectation is that so long as the Department of Education exists, the Title IX regulations are going to be less strict and, less adjudicated than they were in the Biden administration. That's just the situation. Whether you agree with it or not, as I said, is up to you.
So, going back to what you said about, what proportionate means. Proportionate could mean, again, part of their TV deal. So whatever the women's sports TV deal is, they get the same proportion of that the men's teams do. Or proportionate could mean split down the middle, 50% and 50%. And then it's not really proportional. Then it's subsidized. Again, something I would think the Trump administration is not really a big fan of. So even though we're doing this interview, we're talking about it now, it could all go away in a month before the settlement even gets signed. But is that where the confusion is going to come in for the NCAA of, okay, do we just make sure that, okay, if we're giving this percentage to football, that's the same percentage that women's basketball gets, even though that's a smaller pie that we're giving a percentage of?
Yeah, I 100% think that's going to be the confusion, because you could look at proportionate, the definition of that word a number of ways, and I'm 100% sure that there will be some sort of lawsuit or some sort of complaint to the Department of Education that's going to ask this question, right? What I'm not so sure about is sort of, this is like a little bit in the weeds, but I promise it matters. The Department of Education is calling the House revenue sharing payments athletic financial assistance. So it's basically classifying that money the same way they do with like scholarships. And as far as I'm aware, the Department of Education doesn't look at how much revenue the football team generates in order to say how much scholarship money the football team should get versus, women's lacrosse. It's more about how many players there are, and it's not really about the business of it. So I think that could be another wrench, about like how, if we have to follow how the scholarships are split up, that's how the house payments are going to be split up, And then there's one other thing I've been thinking about, which is there's a lawsuit currently about whether or not Title IX applies to NIL deals. And I don't know specifically how this memo is, or if at all, it's going to affect that case. But that case is like a separate track from a federal agency like the Department of Education, right? Like that becomes the law of the land. That's a court and a federal judge. So there are like even more extenuating factors beyond just Trump coming in and us not understanding quite what this memo means. Like there's even more beyond that is currently in the works to confuse all of them.
So, and I saw that NIL also falls under this, right? And it also falls under the athletic assistance, but that's not what NIL is at all by its own true thing. That's outside businesses. Is that just an attempt for them to try and regulate who can give this money and how they're connected to the university, like boosters?
So yes and no. They're basically saying the only quote NIL money that has to be categorized as financial assistance is NIL money that the school gives the players. So like those revenue sharing statements. It was interesting because they didn't like literally the memo said essentially they haven't decided whether outside third party deals, even from boosters like NIL collectives, they haven't like decided if those deals have to follow Title IX, but they sort of hinted that there is a legal mechanism for a school to be punished if a third-party organization that is affiliated with it is not being equitable. So we don't really, like, it doesn't really mean anything now. It's kind of a threat, and it's a threat made by a lame duck agency, essentially, that is about to completely change its political bent. So, like, as of this exact moment, collectives don't have to follow Title IX, but essentially the DOE is saying, like, they might in the future, and an athletic department should, I guess, like pressure their collective to be more Title IX compliant because the athletic department could get punished.
Is this one of the more confusing things that you've had to cover in this whole mess?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say it's right up there with when I first had to learn about antitrust law when I was covering the Alston Supreme Court case. I would say these are the two most complicated things for sure.
So, you're headed to Atlanta, correct? Am I to understand that, or am I wrong?
Yes, I am sitting in the airport right now. So if you hear any announcements or people yelling, that would be LaGuardia in New York for you.
One of my least favorite places not New York City, not New York City. I love New York City nearly unconditionally, but LaGuardia Airport is not one of my favorite places to be, which I think it's not anybody who works there. You could make $1 million a year and hate going into LaGuardia Airport because it's a nightmare. JFK, same thing. But I'm curious your thoughts on the game we have coming up and what you think the playoff has maybe illuminated for the entire college sports world about what they're missing out on, what they may change, and all that.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest sort of business-related thing that I see about the future of the playoff is these first-round home games were so successful and so popular. There's been sort of a conversation about whether or not in future iterations of the playoff there should be more rounds played on campus. And, look, those 4 games we all talked about how they were blowouts. I do think that was a bit of a fluke, right? So let's put that aside for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that, the New Year's Six Bowls have a very sort of financial, legal, and cultural relationship to the college football playoff, but I would be shocked if there wasn't a push for more on-campus games. How do I feel about the national championship? Well, first of all, look, I love football as much as the next person, but this has been a long playoff. I was just talking to my editor yesterday. I mean, this is longer than March Madness, and March Madness is 68 teams. This is only 12. So, I feel like the scheduling, and the concern about whether that impacted the ratings for the semifinals, they might have to talk about that. But I think the game that we have, I couldn't ask for a better game, in my opinion. Maybe I'll be kicking myself for telling you this, but I'm kind of thinking that, I don't know. If I were a betting person, I'd put my money on Notre Dame. There's just something about them. So that's what I think, and I might regret it come Tuesday morning, but you can lose this recording on Tuesday if I'm wrong.
Oh, sure. I promise I'll do that. Look, Notre Dame, everything in my brain, I feel like you do. Everything in my brain says this is Ohio State. Notre Dame's got too many injuries, but I can think of 4 or 5 teams throughout the last 25 years or so that won it, and they had those same kind of things going on. The one I compare them to the most is 2000 Oklahoma, who, if you watch 2000 Oklahoma play, there were a lot of times you're like, I don't know how good they are, but they just kept winning. And the same thing looks at Notre Dame. There are things that they are elite at, but they're not across the board, 2019 LSU, dear God, get out of the way or you're going to get run over. But they have this something about them that doesn't let them fall out of games. And if you can do that against anybody, then you can muddy the waters. And I look at the Nebraska game that Ohio State played that was close the entire time, that Nebraska maybe 1 year from now with more experience would have won that game. And then I look at the Michigan game, which is a team full of experience that didn't crumble late against Ohio State. And I think Notre Dame's going to try to make it like that.
100%. I mean, look, I think maybe it was after the quarterfinals, maybe when Riley Leonard was like, look, it wasn't pretty, but we got the win. And to me, that's them, right? It's it's not always pretty, but they're somehow managing to pull out wins, whether the entire team has the flu, whether they have injuries. I mean, it's been unbelievable. So, I I was 3 years old during the 2000 Oklahoma run, so I can't speak to that, but I'll take your word for it.
Look, I was a sophomore. Junior at Florida State, who lost to them, and 2000 Oklahoma still keeps me up at night because there was no, going into the game, there was no reason to think that Florida State, who'd only lost to Miami the year before, who 2001 Miami is one of the greatest teams, if not the greatest of all time, they'd only lost to them in a game, and everybody's like, well, Oklahoma's this upstart. FSU or Miami, whoever plays them, is just going to run through them. And then Oklahoma muddied the game. It was like 13-2, some kind of terrible score, and won the game behind it. Last thing for you. I saw you mention that the NCAA gets all this stuff happening at the same time. This was released the weekend before the CFP. And then the House settlement is finalized first weekend of the NCAA tournament. Is that what it is?
It's actually the day of the men's national championship.
Oh my gosh.
Is that hearing? Yeah. So 10 a.m. Pacific, I believe, on April 7th will be the hearing to finalize, to rubber stamp the settlement. And the national championship game will be several hours later. And of course, the women's national championship game will be several hours before on Sunday. So.
They're so good at scheduling. I don't know. I'm surprised that you even have a job reporting on the NCAA because everything's so smooth all the time.
There's nothing going on. I know. It's like I'm making up stories.
Yeah. You're one of the best, Amanda. Thank you so much for being with us today. Enjoy Atlanta. Try to get to Fat Matt's. Pretty good ribs there at Fat Matt's.
Ooh.
So
I will. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Amanda Christovich, Front Office Sports, with us here on 365 Sports. More in a minute.